this discussion is the crucial issue of tackling the learning crisis in the Indian schooling system through the lens of equity and quality. The panel will focus on acute learning crisis in Indian schools, its causes, and explore potential solutions. As the Bharatiya Janata Party-led NDA government is all set to introduce the new education policy, there's a lot of speculation and anticipation about the nature and direction of this policy. The panel will focus on key concerns of equity and quality in order to identify challenges related to resources, capacity, and implementation bottlenecks. The speakers will discuss a wide range of solutions, reforms, and recommendations related to teacher education and profession, holistic vision of education, availability of resources, and affordable private schools in the country. Our moderator for the day is for the panel is Professor Akshay Mangla from the Harvard Business School. He teaches courses in government and international economy. Professor Mangla's expertise lies in the political economy of development with a regional focus on South Asia. His current research seeks to understand when and how public institutions work effectively in developing economies, particularly for the poor. He's a faculty associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, a member of the steering committee of the South Asia Institute at Harvard, and co-director of the Brown-Howard MIT Joint Seminar on South Asia Politics. I now welcome Professor Mangla to start the
Thank you. Hello? Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I just want to start by thanking the panel managers for organizing this panel. I'm actually very excited that education is on the agenda for these 2 days. I'll make a few remarks before we start the panel, but first let me introduce our panelists. First, we have here Professor Lant Pritchett. He's a professor of the practice of international development at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard, and he's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Now, anyone who's worked on education in India has to have come across some of Lant's research. He's written extensively on the issue of primary education, in particular in India, and the Indian state more broadly. He spent many years at the World Bank. Some of those years were spent in India, working with public agencies in the Indian state. And Lant's recent book, The Rebirth of Education, Schooling Ain't Learning, I think is quite relevant for this panel and gets at the heart of the acute learning crisis in India and other developing countries. I would highly recommend you all take a look at it. Next, we have Tara Beteile, who's seated next to Lant, senior economist at the World Bank. And her work is she's in the education practice, and her area focuses on project design, implementation, and research. She covers school education up to higher education. She's trained as an economist from Stanford University and specializes in the economics of education. And she also is at the World Bank and working on teacher labor markets and teacher politics in India, and several publications coming out of that work. Finally, I have Amita Chudgar, who's an associate professor in the Department of Educational Administration at Michigan State University. And her work aims to identify policies to address educational challenges facing developing countries, focusing on issues of equity and access, and also on educational achievement in a comparative context. So she's looked at large-scale interventions across large countries like India and tried to understand the role of policy-relevant variables in ensuring equal educational opportunities for the disadvantaged children. So with that, I want to say a few remarks to motivate the panel, and then we'll give it to each of the speakers. So I'm a political scientist by training, and so this problem of India's acute learning crisis, I wanted to situate as a broader governance crisis facing India, which is really a crisis of the Indian state. So as a political scientist, we tend to think of, when do you get effective mass education systems, and we look at two overarching categories of factors. One is political will, the other is the capacity of the state to implement that will. And if you look at India's post-independence history, in 1950, the Indian Constitution declared that, quote, "The state shall endeavor to provide an education for all children up to 14 years of age," and it sets a time frame of 10 years. I know of no other constitution that says in a decade that it will carry this task out. As we all know, this was never fulfilled. And it continues to be a goal, though not as distant as it was back then. but much remains to be done, even with Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and all the policies that have come out. So one might be tempted to think that the desire for mass education really comes out of good intentions, statements like these. But if you look at the history of mass education systems across different countries, often the intentions are far from benign. Often it's the will of the state or some other dominant group to control and socialize citizens into a particular ideology, a particular set of social norms, language, a particular religion. And so these sources of social control, I would say, were not viable for India, in fact. Because the Indian state, A, was divided on linguistic lines, so states controlled the language of textbooks in schools. And one could also have to consider the fact that religion couldn't be the basis for spreading education. India came out of a partition, and communal tensions were a serious concern. So the idea that everyone would adopt a particular religion couldn't be the basis for schooling either. So to achieve political unity, right, the Indian state, in fact, could not carry out many of the activities that other countries have carried out to expand mass education. And it's no surprise that investment was made in higher education. These were areas that New Delhi could control to some extent, especially centralized universities. They could not control primary schools. Now, when one looks at the expansion of education since then, the series of policies, so thinking about the 1986 policy under Narasimha Rao, the National Education Policy, which was revised in 92, then Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan in 2000, RTE Act in 2010. In each of these cases, the impetus for policy change actually came from a handful of elites. Governing elites, bureaucrats, international agencies, and the judiciary in the case of the RTE Act. Mass education didn't just spring out of mass electoral politics. Though some states have different experiences with mass education at the national level, though that was not the case. Next, I move to the issue of state capacity. And here I think one has to pay close attention to the fact that the Indian state was never actually developed for the purposes of public service delivery. It was a law and order state under the British, and it became even more of a law and order, what I call a legalistic state, to ensure democracy and the strict adherence to democratic procedure. And so in this culture of legalism within the state, I mean, the basic idea is to follow rules and procedures, not to solve problems, and not to address the needs of particular communities, which could require a lot of innovation on the ground. It could require a lot of discretion on the ground. That's not what the state is geared to do. And if we see the response to this crisis of state capacity, right, the response of civil society and the Indian middle class and political leadership has largely been to create more laws. We need more rules to govern this state. We're not looking at the ways in which the norms that function inside the state could be improved, or how to reform institutions from inside. So with that framing, I want to turn it to my panelists to think about this hard question of implementation. While we're here to talk about the new education policy, isn't it fundamentally a problem of implementation? And so with that, I'll pass it on to Lant. Thank you. Is it?
Oh. Wow, that's not working. So I'm sure everyone recognizes how weird this is, right? Okay,
Here we go.
I mean, something controls these mics. They have to be turned on. That, like, you're looking at me, and you're looking at the audience, and you're thinking, I'm going to talk about Indian education? Like, that's really weird, right? So in order to sort of mitigate the weirdness a bit, I'm going to talk about what's happened in my country, the United States. And I think what's happened in my country creates the nightmare scenario that unfortunately is the likely scenario of what's going to happen in your country. How so? Well, the United States is one of the few countries in the world that has kept track of the performance of its students at various levels in a consistent, comparable basis since the 1970s. So we kind of know how well I performed. I graduated from high school in 1977 versus how well my kids performed 30 years later, right? And since. And it's exactly the same. the level of learning performance of kids in high school in America today is almost exactly what it was when I was in high school. Now again, look at me like I'm old. Think of all the ways in which the world is different from 1977. All the ways in which the world is revolutionarily different, and in many ways revolutionary better. And one thing that hasn't changed is how much a typical high school kid actually knows and can do in terms of basic educational outputs today versus 1977. That's shocking, unbelievable shocking. And on every measurable indicator of inputs, schools are enormously better. So if you measure expenditure per pupil, it's roughly 3 times as high in the United States now versus when I was in high school. If you measure the fraction of teachers with advanced degrees, it's at least twice as high today as it was when I was in high school. If you measure just anything about the physical facilities, the paper qualifications of teachers, expenditures, it's all enormously better. Okay? So, enormously more. And, by the way, I heard the other day from someone who trusts, I haven't looked this up, and there's been roughly $60 billion just spent on research of how to improve learning outcomes. Okay? So, and that's what, 1974 to 2004, that's 40 years. Okay? So, what does India decide to do with its new education policy? I can bet you $1 on a dime what it's going to do. It's going to talk primarily about expanding precisely the dimensions on which the U.S. has improved. It's going to talk about better qualified teachers in terms of paper qualifications. It's going to talk about better facilities in terms of demonstrable, listable, adjudicable, legalistic terms of what constitutes a quality school. It's going to talk about bureaucratic processes, and it's not going to go to the heart of the matter. And 10 years from now, if that's what India does, India's learning outcomes will be exactly 10 years from now what they are today. They will fail in exactly the same way to improve learning outcomes that the United States has failed to improve learning outcomes over the last 40 years. So that's where you're headed. And it's because just you're not going to go to the heart of the matter, which is implementation, which is the norms and practices of what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a school, what it means to have an education. And if you continue a legalistic, input-oriented kind of procedural approach, it will work to get kids in school. It will not work to put India on a trajectory to improve learning outcomes of the type it desperately needs, because while the U.S. is on a PISA internationally comparable like score, still puttering along at quite good levels because most of the world hasn't figured out how to make it better either, India is enormously behind other countries in the world in terms of the skills with which their children emerge from the schooling system equipped. And again, just enormously behind. On a PISA-like scale, the 2 states that participated, India, only 2 states participated, and states everyone thought ex ante would be of the better Indian states, Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh, and they were, of all the regions in the world that took this assessment, they were the bottom 2 except for one country which I think was Kyrgyzstan, which is some country you don't want to emulate, right? I've never heard anyone say, well, let's be Kyrgyzstan on anything. Anyway, so it's not as if India can be as complacent in the United States that we're kind of floating along at the global mean anyway and nobody else is figuring it out. India is at a level of roughly, a level at which they are, the typical Indian kid is emerging just radically ill-equipped for the 19th century in terms of their actual learning, much less equipped for the future of the 21st century they'll actually face. Let me stop there because I'm sure I've already provoked too many questions, but we want the other panelists to say something.
Great.
What are these, like, can you just say what are these measures of the learning outcome?
These are things.
How do you, what?
What are the measures of the learning outcome? Like, what do you mean by learning outcome? How are they measured? What are the indicators?
Well, there's a variety of different indicators that people use. Some of them are PISA-like indicators that attempt to measure students' ability to apply concepts. Some of them are really simple indicators, like can you read, can you do math. There's a whole array of indicators done by various things. They all add up to exactly the same result.
Yeah. Okay. And
I don't think that question is like that important. I mean, no matter how you measure learning outcomes, Indian kids are just enormously ill-equipped for the world. I mean, if you look at the ASER results, which measure really super basic things, you know, basic, can you read a text with fluent, second grade text? Enormous fractions of kids can't read a second grade text. If you look at the sophisticated end of PISA, they can't apply concepts. So whether you look at basics or sophisticated, any pedagogical approach of assessment all produces exactly the same results.
next we'll have Beteile. And I just ask that we hold off questions until the very end. Thank you.
Hi, does this mic work?
Yep.
Okay.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try and talk about 3 issues really quickly with the hope of also sharing some solutions. Let's see how it goes. So the first touches a little bit on what Lant just talked about, which is, we frankly just don't have teachers who can teach students what they need to learn. But that's a huge, big topic. There are many different parts to it. So I'm going to take one chunk of it, which is, it's important to be able to attract and have high-quality teachers in your system. But to do that, you need to have good teacher recruitment practices in place. And this speaks to implementation. So even though after the Right to Education Act and the National Council of Teacher Education putting out a bunch of guidelines on, how should teachers be recruited.
I think she's on now.
Oh, is it?
This is our IT guy. He's helping us out.
It's working. It's working. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Great. Thanks.
So just coming back to that. So having high standards for teachers is important, and those have been set in a number of policy documents. But you also need to have a recruitment process for teachers that is timely, transparent, and prompt. And recently, I did some work with some colleagues in 9 states in India to understand how are they recruiting teachers. And what we found was 2 main things that just jumped out. One is that the process is so ad hoc that nobody who's seriously considering a profession in teaching would be attracted to that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what is so ad hoc about it. And the second is that schools don't really get to have much say in the teachers they get. Even in terms of choosing the subject, they're just given teachers if they're lucky, and then they have to figure out what to do with them. Now, coming back to the first one, which is this ad hocism. And a simple example is Rajasthan, which on paper has a very clear policy that, in April, we will figure out how many teachers are needed, and then we'll move forward. But actually what has happened, if you look in the past 10 years, is that there are recruitment drives only around election time. And there's no consistency in the number of teachers that are recruited. And some years you'll find it's 20,000, and in other years you'll find it's 40,000. And it doesn't seem like there's been any need analysis done at all. It's just, let's recruit teachers. There's a good thing to do right now. We can have our grassroots political workers through that mechanism. So Rajasthan is one example. Then there's the example of Jharkhand, which has about 40 to 45% of teacher vacancies, and yet it keeps upgrading its schools. So a primary school becomes a middle school, and it has no teachers. And this happens because it's politically unattractive. We are going to get you a middle school near your village. But actually, they're just empty. There's nothing there. And there's simply no recruitment strategy at all for those places. And anyway, there are a bunch of examples from all these states. And what you'll find is timelines vary. There's no, if you were a teacher applicant, you would never know when recruitment is going to happen. You would also not know whether you're going to be paid the same as happened in the previous recruitment cycle. And finally, you would just, you really would not know whether you need connections or not, or how this whole thing happens. So you don't know very much in the process. And if you think about it, when you were applying for, those of you who are studying here, when you're applying for Harvard, if you didn't know anything about what you were getting into, you won't apply here, right? And so you just don't attract very good people because the recruitment process itself is so flawed. Now this ad hocism in recruitment happens because in many states, there isn't a recruitment body that only does teacher recruitment. It happens through the Public Services Commission, and they're doing recruitment for all the government departments. And school education is frankly not a huge priority. So that's one reason. Another reason is that when you do have a committee set up entirely for education, as in Punjab, it keeps changing every year. There's a new chairperson every year, and then they have to revisit all the rules, are redrawn up, then there are agitations, teacher union protests, and it gets stalled there. A third reason is, and it's interesting, it's related to increasing transparency in the system, which has to do with the teacher eligibility test. So one of the things that we found out was, the teacher eligibility test is all very well because, teachers, you set a sort of basic floor and teachers take it and then you recruit on the basis of that. But actually, because you also have to then provide all the answers, there have been so many court cases in these states that we visited. And once there's a court case, you really have to just put a stay on recruitment, and that's it, you see. So these are sort of some of the challenges around the ad hocism. The second part, which was the fact that schools just have no say in which teacher they get. It's, if you're lucky in a state like Karnataka, then it's aggregated at the block level and it's sent up. But after that, it's just sort of, schools will get somebody or the other. And again, related, an interesting thing, which is policy trying to be more transparent, has suggested that there be no interviews in this process. And that really actually makes it much worse in some ways, right? Because you don't even get to meet the teacher and see if he or she is a fit for your school at all. Now, so that was enough about the challenges in that. Coming to some of the solutions, what we found was that Tamil Nadu, in terms of addressing this, completely chaotic recruitment system, has a teacher recruitment board, which none of the other states right now have. Some want to get it, but it's obviously not that easy, so they haven't been able to. And through the recruitment board, they start the process as it should, which is they ask schools to send them what are their requirements, then they aggregate it, they send that up to the state level, which then talks to the finance department and they figure out how many schools, how many teachers they can actually have as per the budget. And in Karnataka, also you have a pretty transparent system. It's recent. Well, actually, the appointment recruitment system is not that recent. It's about 14 years old. They've got a new transparent transfer system. But here too, it's you can see everything that's happening. It's all online, so teachers can, once they take these tests, a set of 3 tests, and they are ranked, and then they're given priority according to certain criteria, and then they get to choose which school they want to go to. So in terms of solutions, these are 2 states worth looking at. I think there's something to understand from how they've been able to address these problems. Very mundane, not a very exciting sounding problem, but actually very core to being able to at least attract high quality, serious candidates. So that was one of the things that I wanted to speak about. The second, again, when you go through these framework documents that they have in the National Policy of Education, they'll talk about should we have more teachers and should we, what kind of teacher should we have? And the question is, well, most of these teachers don't know very much more than their students. And so what has happened in trying to fill up schools is that a number of contract teachers have been recruited. And this contract teacher policy was very, very attractive in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s. And especially in some states. And the 2 main states that started off were Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. And the arguments in favor of contract teachers was that they're much cheaper, they're more motivated, and frankly, the learning gains, they're indistinguishable. At best, they're indistinguishable between contract teachers and regular teachers. Opponents would say, well, these guys are, if they're putting in more effort, it's only because they want a regular job. It has nothing to do with the fact that this is performance-based in any sense. The second part was that they're going to unionize anyway. And the third part was that if they are well qualified, as they are in many states actually, better educated than the regular teachers, and it's a little unfair that they're being paid so differently for doing the same work. And anyway, what we found in this 9-state study was that there is an increasing trend towards regularization of teachers now. These 2 states, for instance, in Rajasthan, you cannot hire a contract teacher anymore. There was a big court case, and the High Court has put a ban on contract teachers. In Madhya Pradesh also now they have reversed it. It was all contract teachers at one point, and now you will be recruited as, they don't call it contract teacher, but it's sort of on the assumption that after 3 years you'll be regularized. They have tried their best to make it merit-based in terms of students' examination results, but actually that's not happened at all. It's mainly political connections, and you get regularized. So these 2 states, which were the big outliers in the 90s and had started towards contracts, have gone completely the other way. Then the other states, such as Orissa, has, after 6 years, you get regularized. In Punjab also, you get regularized. In Karnataka, there was never any contract teacher hired, nor in Tamil Nadu. And in Mizoram, they tend to still do contract teachers because that seems to be the norm now. In Jharkhand, the qualifications and requirements are the same, whether you're a contract teacher or not. So anyway, what has resulted from all of this huge mess is that there's been a lot of unionization among contract teachers of different categories. There are many categories of contract teachers in a given state. And when unionization happens, often strikes also happen, which means 10, 12 days, 1 month, or whatsoever, and school is shut. No learning happens. Right? Then there are other things such as just court cases, which take up a lot of bureaucratic time because you do have to end up going to court and seeing what's happening. So here we have to think a little more clearly, and I don't have a very clear solution on what we can do about contract teachers, because we have to be able to find a way of getting schools teachers, and there isn't that qualified pool of people to man them with. Now the third thing, and how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Okay, the third thing that I wanted to talk about was on higher education, where I've been doing a little bit of work recently, and speak a bit about private colleges in engineering. Now in India, there's been a tremendous land shift in terms of general higher education and technical education. In 2008, about 80% of students were studying general higher education. Today, it's about 40%. So now we have nearly 50% in technical education. Most people who study technical education study engineering, and most of engineering is private in India. Nearly 91% of engineering colleges are all private. Now, if you work in higher education at all, you'll hear a lot of allegations of it being highly inequitable, highly corrupt, but actually not a lot of data to tell us what's going on. So we looked at data from a bunch of different states and at the National Sample Survey, and we found some very interesting things. For one, between 2008 and 2014, there's been a huge increase in the availability of engineering colleges in rural areas. So the urban-rural gap has really come down. The other gap that has really come down is the general population and SC/ST population gap in terms of accessing college. The one that has not moved much is the gender gap. But it's interesting to keep in mind that it hasn't increased inequity in any sense in terms of at least access. Then we looked at the cost of this education. And again, not as high as it's made out to be. We looked at very detailed audit level data, which is sort of not that easy to fix. In UP, for instance, where a lot of the data is made publicly available, we looked at the fees, and it's a pretty narrow range. It's all around 70,000 rupees. And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? According to me, it's not such a good thing, because then you don't get to, you can't get quality and you can't signal quality at all. It's too highly regulated what's happening there, and people who want to break regulations will find a way about doing it. So this is something which was interesting to find, that actually the fees are not that exorbitant. Fees from government colleges are also pretty high, because oftentimes they have self-financing courses which you have to pay for and you aren't aware of when you join. And then coming very quickly to the things that I think we can take away from this example. One is that there are systems and states that we absolutely don't expect to have these systems, such as Uttar Pradesh, on building transparency in terms of student fees. And these are worth looking at and understanding a little bit more. There are problems, there are IT problems in those examples, but they're not problems we can't solve. The second part was that we actually do not have very much data on quality at all. And that we have to work a little more on. So I may have gone over my 2 minutes, but that was it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And yes, Amita, please.
Okay, one more time. I think it's working, yeah? Okay. So it's been fantastic to hear Lant and Tara speak, and Akshay, your comments were very interesting too. I want to thank Swati and Saujanya. It's very nicely put together. Just all the organization. So there are many things to think about, and you know, I'll take 12 minutes. You might want to give me a little heads up because I might just keep going otherwise. But and I hope that your questions help us discuss some of the issues that we didn't even get to, the privatization in education. And I'm glad that Tara spoke about higher education. So several important things to think about. I decided to focus on one very specific thing. Truly really specific, but I think quite significant, and it ties in very well with both the comments that speakers have made earlier. And that's, I want to broadly talk about teacher education in India. And so I want to lay out a couple of sort of background pieces of information, kind of three facts or observations. And then based on that, you know, draw some conclusions or observations. And perhaps unlike them, I don't have grand recommendations because I sit as an academic, my mind, perhaps I don't have that kind of view in terms of what could be done, but I'll share a couple of thoughts and then we'll see where we go with it. So one thing to note about teacher labor market in India at the outset, it's huge, and like anything in India, we are a large country and that's bound to be the case. So right now in 2014-15, we have 8 million teachers around at the elementary level. Just to put this number in perspective, in the United States, my understanding is this number is around 3 million teachers, which kind of makes sense. Another way to think about this number is that in 04-05, so about 10 years ago, the teacher labor force was 4.5 million. So there has been a double increase in the last 10 years in the teacher labor force. Now that makes sense because, as several of you know, our country has done very well in terms of enrolling children in school. You know, we have succeeded in bringing tens of millions of new children in the school system in the last, at this point, more than a decade ago, about, since early 2000. And so when you bring 30, 40 more million children into school, you ultimately need to staff those classrooms. You just can't keep increasing class sizes, right? So this growth in teacher labor force makes sense. This 8 million kind of makes sense. The other observation that seems evident to me is that likely it's still going to grow, the teacher labor force that we have. And there are a few observations to note. So one is that we still have significant number of schools which are single teacher schools. So that means one teacher is staffing the entire school, all the grade levels, whatever, from grade 1 to 4 or so forth and so on. And those numbers vary, but like in a state like Bihar, say 14% schools are single teacher schools. In Andhra Pradesh, 17% single teacher schools. So that tells you that there is going to be more need. Another indicator to think about is the pupil-teacher ratio, how many students per teacher. And there too, it appears that we have room to grow here, the teacher labor force. So again, the Right to Education Act recommends 30:1 ratio. And we have on average many states meeting that standard. But again, a state like Bihar has, and Uttar Pradesh, somewhere between 40 to 60% schools don't meet that 30:1 ratio. And a state like Gujarat, which is on the whole doing well, even has 6-7% schools that don't meet the ratio. So that kind of points us to the fact that we have a large teacher labor force which is likely going to grow in the foreseeable future to compensate for these needs. And another observation I want to make, I can't resist making as a side note, very interesting, is that in our country, teaching is not yet a feminized profession, which is quite different than if you look at teaching profession in the developed world. So female teachers are not more than 50% of the teacher labor force. They are right around 48%. And there are still 25% schools in the country at the elementary level which don't have a female teacher at all in the school. So anyway, that's sort of a side note. So now it's a large labor force, it's likely to grow. What does the research tell us about teachers? And you have heard a little bit of this already in Tara and Lant's comments, is that, and this evidence is sort of strongest in the United States where you have great data available, that if a teaching can be effective, then teachers would be the single most important policy factor which can make a difference in a child's learning and potentially even long-term outcomes. And so teachers are quite significant and quite important for a well-functioning education system if the teacher was effective. So that research does not seem to be in great dispute. Now there is a second part to it. So how do you make a teacher effective? And we again heard a bit about that. And that's where I would say that the research does have some disputes. And a basic, simple way to break it down would be that are these effective teachers born? They just sort of, they're people who are? Or can you have good teacher training which can make a difference and make someone become that effective teacher? Now, I sit in a college of education, so you can imagine that the view in my college tends to be more in favor of teacher training, but that's that, and I will accept that it's an open area of debate, right? But that being said, that teacher training may or may not be effective and may or may not effectively produce effective teacher, the fact is that our country, like other countries, has a large teacher education system. So that is the third observation I want to make. So what is happening in our teacher education system right now? So there are sort of two ways, two sides to any teacher education training system. What happens pre-service? So what happens when as you're aspiring to be a teacher? Tara spoke about recruitment, which is after you have finished that training. So what happens at the training phase? And then what happens once you are in service? What kind of support do you get? So on the front end, the basic summary of the situation is that our teacher education system is academically speaking a mess. It's not functioning at all as it should. And if you want to read up about this, there is a report, Justice Verma Commission report, a 2012, you can find it on the net, a 3-volume study that speaks about this issue in great detail.